Welcome to The Forest Garden, your guide to transforming your organic gardening practice into an edible, holistic forest garden landscape. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, we're going to be discussing all things fall abundance. Fall is a great time to start cleaning up, preparing things, getting things ready for the upcoming winter season. You might think this time of year there's not much going on in the garden, and frankly that's just not true. So stick around, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Forest Garden Podcast with Ben Bishop and Mike Amato. This episode, we're going to talk about fall composting. It's something that Mike and I can talk about for quite a long time. We've done a lot of composting in our lives, and it's really interesting and really important for the fertility and nutrition and cycling in a forest garden. So we hope you get some great tips and good information out of it. And it's going to be the first part of several episodes in the coming weeks that are going to be involved with specifically fall in the food forest and what we do and what we recommend for people who want to do forest gardening. And whether that's something you're establishing for the first time or you're maintaining a food forest that's more well established, we hope you get something out of it.
We're really going to be talking about all things fall abundance. So one thing that the fall really gives us is an abundance of fall leaves from deciduous trees. As always, we're going to be talking about things from sort of our perspective. Being in a zone 6 or borderline zone 7 climate, I'm in the Northeast, Ben is in the Midwest. Is Missouri considered the Midwest? I think
Absolutely.
it is. Yeah, so if you're in the tropics, this is going to be a little bit different for you. Your fall and your spring are a little bit, less extreme than ours, perhaps. But basically, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about all things fall, the importance of composting, the importance of fall leaves, sourcing compost materials, different things you can do to clean up your garden, and the benefits of using the woody materials and the greens and browns. And we're going to break down all of that. So I guess before we really jump into anything, I could do this, but Ben, would you like to define for some of our listeners who might not be completely aware exactly what maybe the definition of compost is, or just for someone who's never heard compost before?
Sure. And I think this does tie into the theme of this episode, fall, because it's a good time to start preparing your beds for the following year. And it's something that takes center stage when things start to slow down and you have less of a use for your organic matter and your kitchen scraps and your yard wastes and that sort of thing, because during the summer, everything's growing. It's very easy to utilize, but you kind of have to be a little more careful and intentional about where you put your materials for composting when it's winter, because, there's a lot less things growing. But sure, let's look at compost and let's see if I can kind of wrangle up a good definition. So there are different pathways that organic matter can go down in terms of decomposition. So first of all, organic matter is carbon material, and that could be carbonaceous material like straw and wood chips and leaves and sawdust. There's plenty of different options for carbon material, but organic matter also refers to nitrogen sources, which are also carbon. There's also carbon and nitrogenous materials too. Those are all considered organic matter, and I'll talk about the balance between those two things in a minute. But essentially, you have the decomposition of organic matter that can go down to two different routes, and that's anaerobic, meaning without oxygen. And when you're dealing with compost, that's the opposite of what you want. So I think most of us, myself included, first time we try to do composting, we hear that we can just throw all of our kitchen scraps into a bucket or a trash can or a pile, and eventually it'll just turn to compost. Well, it doesn't quite work like that, because there's a lot of water content, there's a lot of nitrogen in those sort of wet green materials, and it can basically, all of that moisture, all of that nitrogen can starve out oxygen in your composting process. And then instead of turning the compost, it goes anaerobic and it starts to rot. And then it will off gas, which is in part that smell that everyone can identify as something rotting. And if you smell that when you're composting, you're doing something wrong. Composting should not smell bad ever. And so there's that route. And then there's the aerobic route, which is where there's oxygen involved. And the best way to do that when you're composting is to include a nice balance of carbonaceous and nitrogenous materials. So like I said, carbonaceous is like those browns. So straw and wood chips and leaves. And then the nitrogenous is your kitchen scraps. So banana peels, coffee grounds, that sort of thing. There's probably, I don't know if I could say the perfect ratio. I kind of just go by feel from my own experience, but you definitely want to err on the side of more carbonaceous material. So you're going to need a lot of that material, which is harder to come by than kitchen scraps, because we produce kitchen scraps all the time when we're at home cooking and that sort of thing. So it's nice to have a lot of things like fall leaves on
Yeah,
hand.
except in the fall. I'm sorry to interrupt, but like the fall is the one time of the year when we have an abundance of browns or carbonaceous material to put into our compost.
Yeah. So what is your carbonaceous material of choice?
Well, fall leaves are the perfect carbonaceous material choice for pretty much every garden system, in my opinion. It is something that all of the neighbors in my, all the people in my neighborhood tend to take their fall leaves and just dump them into the woods or have them be picked up by the town, put them in those little bags. And that's kind of silly. You could, if you have a garden on your property, you can definitely be using them to benefit your landscape in ways that lots of people don't understand. As Ben was talking about, they're incredibly useful. You want to have more browns than greens in your compost system, and I think it's kind of like a 1-to-4 ratio of like 1 being nitrogen and 4 being carbon. Would you say that's about right in your head, Ben?
Yeah, I think that's a safe conservative estimate. There's like charts you can look up, because depending on what the material is and this and how old it is, are they new leaves, are they old leaves, are you using wood chips, are you using fresh, are they dried? Like there's all sorts of different variables that determine the amount of carbon and nitrogen. So it's best just to use rules of thumbs. So yeah, I would say 1-to-3 to 1-to-4 in terms of nitrogen to carbon materials.
Yeah, and another thing to consider is that when you are putting your leaves in the compost, in the anaerobic versus aerobic kind of thing, the negative that fall leaves can have is that they can all get really clumped together. When you want to think about your compost, you're essentially thinking of a lasagna, and the more air in your lasagna in a aerated system is, it's better. Straw is favorable because it actually is a material that has hollow, straw is hollow, so it has air inside of it, and the way it stacks, it doesn't all like get really stuck and clumped together in these big masses the way that leaves do. So that's why a lot of the times people will get not a wood chipper, but some sort of machine that chops it all up. If you are just mowing your lawn and you mow over the leaves and they get all chopped up and shot up into a bag that's in the back of your lawnmower, and then you dump that into your compost or dump it as mulch in places, and then other bits of it go into your compost, that is pretty perfect, I'd say.
Yeah, that stuff's great. And yeah, I bought a leaf chipper, or I don't know what you call it, leaf shredder. And it basically looks like a weed whacker motor in the center, and there's a big funnel, and you throw all of your leaves in, and it as long as you don't jam it, it will shred them all, and you can put a little barrel or a bag underneath, and it will deposit all of the shredded leaves. And they refer to that as leaf mold, which is just basically little shredded up pieces of leaves. And the benefit is that it'll break down quicker because there's more surface area because the leaves are shredded, so it'll turn to compost quicker. And then the other benefit is that because they're smaller, they will take up less area, so you could basically pack a bunch in to your garden bed, or around your trees when you're mulching them. And I tend to think that they won't blow away as easily as whole leaves will, because the whole leaf will act kind of like a big sail, if you can imagine that, like on a boat, and it will catch the wind and blow away. But if you shred them, they tend to stay in place a bit better, I've found. But after a year of that, I just decided I would compost my leaves and cover them with a tarp. And that's been working better than using them as mulch straight out. But yeah, they make fantastic compost or mulch in the fall, and it's great to use for your tree planting that often happens, or any sort of planting that happens in fall.
Yeah, so for our listeners, just kind of the whole purpose of this podcast and the purpose of regenerative agriculture and permaculture in general is to sort of recreate or learn from forest systems. So if you think about the natural forests that have deciduous or even non-deciduous trees, they all drop something, some sort of green material that turns into a brown material, whether or not it's leaves or pine needles. The forest floor isn't bare; it's not bare soil, and that is a really important part of every system. So we want to see that, we want to replicate it. It's, you don't have to just use fall leaves, but fall is the time when we have so many fall leaves that we can be kind of thinking of the quote unquote 4 season composting system, where okay, we can't necessarily be growing things in cold climates in the fall, or well, actually we can, but we'll get to that later. We can't be growing tomatoes or some of the things that we like to grow in the summer, like other big annual crops, eggplants, whatever. But we can be focusing on the sort of less, maybe potentially less exciting elements of the system, like the compost, and really gather up all these materials like fall leaves, like straw, whatever is available and free. And it will ultimately benefit the summer production and the entire system, the soil health, microbes, microbiology, all of it. And that's really what we're all about here, and what you should be all about too. So, do you have anything else to say before I move on?
No, I just think it's a good time to really get your composting game dialed in, because even though it's slower over the winter time, you have all winter long for them to compost, and you have a nice giant pile of compost ready to go for the spring, for when your plants start to wake up.
Okay, so I would like to go into sort of a long list of unusual, potentially unusual composting materials that our listeners, might have never heard of. But before I go into that, maybe we should talk a little bit about the idea of garden cleanup during the fall, and using the elements of the garden as fertilizer, as mulch, bringing it back into the system using natural processes. Imagine your standard annual garden. It's now September, October, maybe November, depending on your climate, when the frost comes in. Your tomatoes are not looking so good, they're brown and dying. Your cucumbers are looking the same. What most people do will just take that and put it sort of in their like rubbish pile in their yard if they don't have a compost going, or they'll take them and just throw them in the compost. And like Ben said earlier about the taking all your just kitchen scraps and just piling up the kitchen scraps, it's equally not, it's just as bad to take just all of your browns and just throw them in the compost. What you really should be doing is, every time that you have a lot of kitchen scraps, you put them in, and then you put browns immediately on top of them and create sort of a lasagna. So it's the same idea when we're cleaning up all of the elements of our garden that are dead or just hanging around and we've been putting it off. We can take that and put it into our compost system, which usually is a heap or something inside of a pallet square, is very popular. And when we're doing that, you should consider, okay, I just put all these browns in. Now is a good time to find some nitrogenous material and put it in as well. That nitrogenous material could be as easy as you just mowed your lawn. It's the fall, but the lawn is still growing, and you mowed the lawn and you have all of the yard clippings. That's your greens. Your browns is brown dead material, and your greens are green nitrogenous material. Browns are carbon. So in that moment, you just have to kind of think of that lasagna and how to make the compost really benefit the most from what's easily available.
One thing I'll add when it comes to the yard waste cleanup in the fall, especially if you're going to use it in your compost, is to be careful about what you're putting in, especially if you're in sort of like a forest garden setting where it's a bit more wild, and there might even be some plants you don't want growing that are on the edge, kind of creeping in. Fall is a time when many plants like honeysuckle or privet or euonymus vines are flowering. Actually, they're going to seed in the fall. And it's a great time to clean those up, hopefully before they actually go to seed, because what you don't want to do is let them go to seed and spread around your garden, or even worse, throw all of these plants that have seeds on them, weed plants that have seeds on them, into your compost. Technically, when you hot compost, which means you're turning it a lot during the winter and getting the temperature really, really high in the compost, technically you should be killing off all of those invasive seeds. But it's very easy to not do that and to miss certain areas. And so what you don't want to do is have a compost full of weed seeds that you spread around your whole garden. So when you're collecting yard waste for compost, you want to make sure that it's free of any debris that might carry pathogens, disease material, and especially weed seeds.
Yeah, I would be surprised if anybody listening hasn't had that specific weed, like it could be creeping Charlie, it could be lamb's quarter, which personally, lamb's quarter I don't view as a weed, but lots of people do. It's edible, it's delicious. Any weed that sets seed very frequently, even something like bittercress, which is another edible perennial plant, but bittercress is especially weedy. You don't want to be harvesting that when it's gone to seed and put it in your compost, but you can take grasses and weeds and things that don't have roots attached to them. It's just the green material and they haven't gone to seed yet, and that should be okay in your compost system. It's important to note that lots of these weeds will spread from the roots or the rhizome, and a little piece of rhizome might create a whole new plant. So thank you, Ben. That's a very important piece of knowledge. So moving on, I was just going to talk a lot about the sort of various compost materials that people might not be aware of as in terms of like what you can compost. Often we have stuck in our heads that compost can only be XYZ things, and the list is like 10 or 12 ingredients. And I was kind of amazed to discover a lot of the compost materials that I could be putting into my hot compost system outside. Before I really delve into that, there are other ways to compost. You can you can make compost tea, which is essentially just taking some sort of, it could literally just be weeds and shrubby material that you were gonna throw away or put in a bag and get to the town. You just stick it in a 5-gallon bucket, pour water in there, let it ferment in your backyard for several weeks. It gets really stinky, and then that becomes a very, very, very loaded with nutrients liquid that you can pour in after diluting it with water, pour onto your plants or pour into your soil to feed everything in the system.
As long as that stink is more of like a yeasty beer, like fresh smell, and not a stink like rotting, like old water, stagnant water smell. Because if someone does compost tea wrong and they're trying it out and it smells really bad, you don't want to put that in your plants. You could kill them. But if it's that sort of smell like beer or wine, or just kind of fermentation, if you've ever done fermentation, that's the kind of smell you're going for. And that goes for composting too. Like you can use your nose, it goes a long way.
Yeah, if you've ever smelled a wet dog, or if you I don't actually, would you say that's accurate? At breweries, frequently I'll smell there's a very strong wet dog smell.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I'm not sure if specifically that is what anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. So yeah, so compost tea is an option. Frequently people will do this with comfrey. They'll take comfrey leaves and turn it into compost tea. And yes, you can do it wrong. I'd say it's not too hard to do it right, however. And another option is a vermicompost system, which is basically where you're allowing worms to do a lot of the work for you. There are lots of DIY setups where you can build your own vermicompost bin in a sort of tower. There's also, vermicompost could be as easy as having a board that you have composting worms under that you lift up and put all of your compost materials into that, and the worms just degrade it for you. And like imagine just a 2x, or not a 2x4. Imagine a long board that you lift up that's attached to the ground, and you just dump worms into it, and then you keep adding compost. And they should be composting worms, not just regular old earthworms. And also some people have vermicompost bins that they have just in their apartment. So if you're in an apartment setting and you want to compost, but you don't really have a way to do it, you should maybe look into the vermicompost setup. It might be a little gross of an idea to have, a worm bin in your apartment, but it's, I don't know, it all depends on your perspective. So moving into my sort of abstract on compost materials here, I'm a little bit of a compost nerd in regards to this kind of stuff. Something that I did over this past winter was that I tried to sustainably source compost materials for fuel mounds that I was building. And also I just kind of wanted to up my sustainability game a little bit. It was the COVID pandemic, and I had a lot of free time. So coffee grounds are an incredible nitrogenous material, which would be a quote unquote green. And I guarantee you at your local coffee shop, it's highly likely that the coffee shop is not composting their coffee grounds. If you approach them nicely, confidently, and just say, hey, I'm an organic gardener or a forest gardener, I'm a nice person, whatever, I am looking for coffee grounds to, add to my compost or add to my garden. 9 times out of 10, the people will be receptive and helpful and, help you out. And those coffee grounds can be added. They can be, you can use them to side dress plants. You can just dump them onto soil. You can layer cake it. You can add them into your compost bin. You can do pretty much whatever. They have an incredible nitrogen rating in their NPK ratio. That similarly, you can go to restaurants and ask them for leftover food scraps. I was also doing this over the winter and into the spring. And one thing to consider here is that when you're doing this, you really don't want to be driving very far to source this kind of stuff. If you can ride your bike, it's great. Ride your bike there and pick it up with a little cart and bring it back if that's possible. If you have to drive, you don't want to be creating a lot of carbon emissions to go pick up compost materials, because that kind of defeats the whole purpose. But if there's a local restaurant that's very close to you, and let's say it's like a smoothie bar, the likelihood that they're going to have an incredible amount of rich, nitrogenous scrap food like banana peels or avocado shells, avocado husks, I don't, whatever, spent food is very, very high. I sometimes, the place that I went to, it was crazy. It's like the wintertime, they're dumping all the food that they can't serve to people because, or they just, whatever, they're throwing it out because they think it's bad. And there'd be like giant, like beefsteak tomatoes, like full, just like untouched, like not even like a drop of mold on them. And it was the wintertime, so they were putting it in a bin and it was being outside. These were all frozen and essentially preserved. I'd be coming home and dumping this stuff into my compost. And I was like, this stuff could have gone to like maybe a food bank. Like, it was just crazy how some of the stuff was so incredibly untouched and just never used. And probably it had been imported from, South America or Central America to get here. It was just so sad to see, what normally would be going into our waste system. And it was really nice. And it felt really good to be just playing a small role and taking some of that stuff out of the waste stream and putting it into my backyard.
Yeah, 40% of the food that's grown is wasted, unfortunately, and the food waste will eventually just turn to methane. Most produce and even other animal products can off gas in the methane, and that's a huge greenhouse gas, really powerful greenhouse gas. So you're right, taking that food out of those waste streams and composting them aerobically really helps to keep the carbon, the methane, from emitting back out in the atmosphere. So yeah, and if you end up composting many tomatoes, you'll probably end up planting a tomato bed unintentionally next year.
Yeah,
hey, that's
and
not a problem.
that's definitely not a problem. You might also be providing a little nice nook and habitat for your vole population, which definitely probably happened for me. But that's not necessarily horrible either. The voles in our system, as much as we dislike them, they do contribute to the ecosystem, and they do benefit predators. And I'm getting very off topic here. I guess I'll stop going off on this tangent. But in any case, so yeah, so going to your local whatever, whether or not it's a coffee shop or it's a restaurant, it's important to check in with these places and just say, hey, like, are you throwing out everything into the trash? All these banana peels, maybe they could go into my backyard. If it's right down the street, it's definitely worth checking in on.
That reminded me, other than going out and finding places to give you this material, The other option is if you or a neighbor is doing are doing tree trimming and hiring, or tree removal, or stump grinding, and hiring a professional who has a grinder or a shredder. I just talk to the guys who are doing it and ask them to just point their dispenser, whatever shoots the, usually they shoot it into their truck and haul it off. But I just say, hey, can you make a giant pile in my backyard instead? And more often than not, they'll say yes. And that has given me hundreds and hundreds of pounds of wood chips over the years.
I've done exactly the same thing. You can call up your local forestry service, or if you just literally Google like tree guy into Google, it'll likely just bring up a random blip of someone's house with their contact info, hopefully. And if you send them a text or give them a call, in my area, it was quote unquote Pete the tree guy. And I just said, hey, free wood chips. And he said, when do you want it? And how much do you want? How frequently? That is a great way to source carbon material for your forest garden or for your compost. Although keep in mind that when it comes to wood chips, they take a much longer period of time to break down if you were to put them into your compost. Similarly, if you were dealing with let's say you're in an area that's sort of a maritime climate, you might have a lot of seafood restaurants around. Seafood restaurants are a fantastic resource. Let's say if they're a place like an oyster bar, the oyster shells are fantastic for your compost. Usually you crush them up, but if you place them in your compost uncrushed, that's okay too. They'll just break down much, 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 much slower, but they have some benefits too. I can talk about later when you don't crush them. In my mind, I'm thinking like the ideal places to go are coffee shops, seafood restaurants, smoothie bars, and the last one, this is where we're kind of getting into like the gross out factor, where when I brought this up originally, my family was sort of like, oh, we don't want that. And that is human hair from salons or barbershops. I know that's probably, resonating with the sort of like, why am I listening to this podcast right now? But human hair has an incredible amount of nitrogen in it. And think about how much nitrogen packed into human hair from salons and barbershops that are just getting thrown out in the trash and going into the waste stream. Instead, we could be taking that, putting it into your compost. It's going to break down. You're not going to eat it necessarily. By the time it ever makes it into your garden, it's going to be just, like what, molecules, just like so broken down.
No, that's definitely outside the box. But I mean, if you can source it, you can basically have unlimited compost if you're creative enough.
Yeah. Let's say you have a best friend who's a hairdresser, which in my case, my best friend's best friend was a hairdresser. I reached out to her and was like, hey, weird question. Can I get some of the hair that, what do you do with it? And she wasn't weirded out at all. She was just like, oh yeah, sure. Like, this is like the 10th time I've done it. And I was like, what? Like, really? And she's like, oh yeah, people want it for their compost all over the place. She's in an area that is more rural, I guess. So maybe people are more used to the idea that hair can be used in composting systems up there. I'm not sure.
We're not so crazy after all.
Yeah, I guess, it's all about your perspective. So that was the beginning of the weird compost materials. The human hair, although that, like, in terms of the gross out factor, that's the first one. I have 3 or 4 other gross out factors that'll come later. Another thing is compost materials from your home. I never really thought about this kind of stuff, including it in our compost. We've always had a compost at my house ever since I was born, probably, or at least since I was a little kid. But like Ben said, usually when you start composting, or when you have been composting for the longest time, you just dump your food scraps into a pile and you think you're making compost, when in reality, it's a little bit more complex than that. You do need to have a bit of a ratio of greens to browns, nitrogen to carbon. And in my house, we have tissues and we have paper towels and newspaper, and all that stuff would just either get thrown out or put in the recycling bin. More often than not, it'd be thrown out. Little did I know, all 3 of those things can be composted and should be composted. Same thing with cardboard. Cardboard can be composted. If it's a box, you should remove all of the tape or whatever, but including layers of these browns that are, basically like separators in the compost system adds more air. It benefits the whole system. It's great. So compost materials from your home, you can use newspapers, not anything that's shiny. You don't want to have the shiny sort of like ad paper. I don't think that's good. Napkins, paper towels, any other paper products, tea bags, which most people know about, but some don't. Weirder one is dryer lint. Any contents of your vacuum, that's sort of a gross out one, but when you're vacuuming, it sucks up all of like the little, dust particles and hair and dead skin cells and all this gross thing, all these gross things that we really don't want to be thinking about. But actually, would the soil microbes will love them. So that's instead of dumping it in your trash, you can dump it in your compost. Same thing with expired beer or wine that went bad or old coffee. Coffee grounds are good, but just regular old coffee in a liquid form is also good. Instead of dumping it down the drain, dump it in your compost bin. Same thing with peanut shells or sort of any sort of nutshell. There's all these weird rules about composting, and lots of people say like, oh, don't put nutshells in your compost, they'll never break down. That's not true. It takes them a long time to break down. If you want them to break down faster, you can crush them. Something like pistachio shells, actually, if you don't break them down, they'll create an underground habitat for microbes and other desirable soil microscopic critters, basically, because it's a little shell that these things can sort of live in and have a weird underground habitat. It's kind of the same thing if you were like earlier when I talked about the oyster shells. It just creates like a little cave underground that apparently creates a habitat for beneficial soil bacteria and soil microbes and nematodes and all those sorts of fun things. Something to be aware of though, all of these recommendations really are on a case-by-case basis in terms of your location. If you're somewhere that is really rural and you have black bears, you probably already know this, but you probably shouldn't be composting period in your backyard unless it's like in a very, very, very bear-proof container. I've heard basically horror stories where bears really like lobster, for example. So if you're composting in your backyard in rural Maine or upstate New York and black bears or whatever type of bear are around, apparently they love lobster, and it's much better to have it picked up and composted by the town or the county. And I've even heard of people freezing all of their compost or taking, after having lobster, freezing it and then putting it outside literally the morning that it comes and gets picked up by the town, because otherwise the compost bin that they have like out front or whatever will just get raided by bears. So this is, you take it with a grain of salt in terms of your specific location. If you have pests like raccoons or that sort of thing, that's really not that big of a deal unless you're really concerned about it for some specific reason. But if you have bears, composting becomes a lot harder and a lot more complex.
Bears have expensive tastes. I didn't realize that.
It's funny. I have a family member who lives in upstate New York, and they once told me a story where they hosted a party and they like shipped over in upstate New York. You can have lobster shipped to you from Maine, like Maine lobster, and it comes pretty relatively quickly and is super fresh as it could be. And they had like set up this big table for all of like 20 of their guests. It was a big affair. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly the mom was like walking out holding a platter of butter for the lobster and just screamed and dropped the butter and ran back in the house. And everyone was like, what's going on? Turned and saw at least like 2 or a whole family of bears slowly sauntering over because they smelled the lobster from afar.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the smell of that lobster really draws them. And lobster smells good. It makes sense. But yeah, so lobster shells, oyster shells, clams, anything from the sea is great for your compost. And you could, smash it or break it up and then it'll break down a lot faster. But it's also okay not to do that, just understanding that it's going to take a lot longer to break down. Lobster will break down, like think about how thin lobster is, like the shell of that's going to break down a lot faster than like a clam shell. That pretty much comes to the end of my weird things that you can compost that you probably never thought of before. But before I hand it back off to you, Ben, I have the sort of gross out compost things to cover. To you and I, it's not probably near as gross. And I'm going to go from like least gross to most gross. So the first thing is rabbit poop. If you have rabbits that poop all over your yard, or if you have a rabbit, let's say that you're dating someone or you're married to someone or you yourself own rabbits, their poop is super great for your garden and it doesn't need any time to age. Lots of manures like horse manure or cow manure, you need to age it before you use it in your garden. That's not the case for rabbits. You can just take the little pellets that look like Cocoa Puffs, that you normally would be throwing out, once again, putting into the waste stream, and you can just put it into your garden or your compost, and your plants will love it. So same thing with llama poop. If you have llamas, also great for your garden, doesn't need to be aged. Or actually, sorry, I don't know if it's llamas or alpacas. I meant to say alpaca just now.
I was gonna say, who do you know that has llamas?
Well, I know someone who has alpacas, and yeah, okay, it's probably the same. It's probably interchangeable. I guess I'll have to look it up, but it's probably both llamas and alpacas, or at least one of them, that you don't have to wait for the poop to break down to use it. A note to our listeners from the recording studio: it is indeed both llama manure and alpaca manure that you can use in this way. Moving into the more gross composting, or gross out factor, human urine is one of the best resources for fertilization or for just benefiting your plants in general. Human urine is mostly made up of urea. If you go to your local Ace Hardware or Lowe's or garden shop, whatever, and you go to a mostly like nitrogenous fertilizer and look on the back and look in the ingredients, it's going to be like 90% urea, which is just a synthesized version of the same thing that you're peeing out of your body. So you can literally go to your tomato garden and just pee directly onto the soil of your tomatoes, and then not have to spend $20 on a, however big bottle of fertilizer. And once again, yes, it's maybe a little gross, but pee is sterile, urine is sterile, and you're peeing into soil, and the soil will love it and your plants will love it. However, it's important to dilute your urine in almost every circumstance when you're doing fertilization this way. Some people choose to pee into something like a bucket and then pour the bucket into a larger vat of water. I've often heard a ratio of 1 to 10 or 1 to 9, 1 being urine and 9 being water. And I've also heard that if your pee is more yellow, then it needs to be diluted more than if your pee is somewhat clear. Moving on into the maximum gross out factor is humanure or human manure. I'm not super well studied in this area, but it is sort of the furthest extent of composting that I have not gotten into yet, and I don't know if I ever will. Some people choose to, in their home, have a composting toilet. And essentially what that is it's a toilet system where you're going to, poo into this large vat that has a vent attached to it and gets rid of any smell. And that vat, which, could be in your basement or in a certain area, or could be outside, will just store your fecal matter, and it will break down, or it will age over time. And as it ages, the bacteria and the pathogens that could be harmful from your body to, for your plants will be gone. And then, just like how you would age horse manure or cow manure, it's the same idea. This is something I haven't gotten into, but in permaculture, it's a big thing. And it's something that we probably should try to get over, and especially in America, like the idea of pooping and using your own poop is disgusting. But think about how much water you use every time you flush a toilet. The toilet is the worst waster of fresh, drinkable water in most households.
That's quite the list, but an important one nonetheless. The other thought is, when you're making your hugel mounds, it sounds like your approach is you're layering your carbonaceous and your nitrogenous materials. And correct me if I'm wrong, you sort of let those sit and you let nature take its course, and you let the worms go in and cycle through the different layers. And then, of course, certain layers will invade other layers, and there's bacteria in the mix and fungi in the mix, and it all sort of turns into compost in the end. And that's a fine method. I would refer to that as cold composting. And then there's the hot composting method, where you're actually going out and mixing your nitrogenous and your carbonaceous materials up. And you do that, you can do that day one when you make your compost, or you could wait until, if you go out next week, you'll go out with your shovel and mix the layers up and continue doing that every week. And the benefit, I always wondered like why people would do this if you could get away with cold composting. Well, the benefit is that your composting will happen faster, and that's not necessarily a good thing or a necessary thing when you're fall composting and winter composting, because like if your compost is done in the middle of February, like great, but you're not going to use it for another month at the very earliest. So that's maybe not the most important reason to hot compost, but the other benefit to hot composting is you're of course raising the temperature, and hopefully as you're mixing it, you're bringing the outer layer into the inner layer, right? Where so the outer layer of the compost now is the inner layer of the compost for this next week, and essentially all parts of your compost pile will be exposed to very high temperatures, which is what you want. The benefits of that is it's going to kill off pathogens, it's going to kill off weed seeds, but at the same time it was explained to me, I'm not a microbiologist, but it was explained to me by a microbiologist that the higher temperatures of the compost pile of hot composting, I don't know what it is, if it's 114 or somewhere around there, the pathogenic bacteria and fungi tend to die off at those temperatures. But as luck would have it, the beneficials can go into a state of dormancy. And I don't know if they sporulate or just deactivate for a certain period of time. Maybe they're thermophilic instead of thermophobic. And so that's another name for this type of composting method, thermophilic compost. And so that way you can selectively kill off all of the disease causing pathogens and all of your weed seeds. And now you have this really nice, nutritious compost that is now free of disease causing pathogens and weed seeds. So, both methods have their validity. I tend to go out and mix. I make a big pile and mix it each week throughout the fall and the winter. It's a nice excuse to get out of your house and get some exercise. But the other part of that and an important question in the composting process is, well, do you every week when you go out to mix your compost, are you adding more in each week, adding your kitchen scraps and your carbonaceous waste or whatever? That same microbiologist from the Rodale Institute, Elaine Ingram, I think her response is, well, would you add ingredients to your cake while it's in the oven? And of course the answer is no. So would you add in more material while your compost is in the process of composting? Well, you could, but then you'll end up with some compost that's totally ready, totally done, some compost that's halfway done, and some compost that's like still, you can see it's eggshells and banana peels. And that's not, you can get away with that in the beginning, but at the end, it's not the end of the world if you have half composted material that you're applying onto your plants, but it's just not ideal. You want to try to maximize and concentrate all that nutrition into a small area so you can apply it efficiently. So you might want to make separate compost piles and separate composting areas so that you can finish one compost while you're adding to the next one. So yeah, that's just the last piece in terms of the composting process in my view. And I usually do a small kitchen compost bucket, and that goes right outside my door to a bigger compost bin that has holes in it so that air can get through and water can leak out, because you want to let the water leak out. And then once that's halfway full, I bring it out to the actual compost pile. So I have 3 different stages to my composting regime, but yours can look however you want. If you live in a city, you might have to take your compost bucket from your kitchen directly to your community garden and hope it doesn't spill all over your seats of your car.
Or hopefully maybe you have a bike with a special baby seat for your compost.
Yeah, even better.
And you can compost in place. You could compost directly into your allotment or your vegetable garden, but it also, you just have to understand that if there are, in doing that, the potential is that rodents can get it and dig it up and potentially mess with any root systems that could be there of perennial plants or whatever. So one of the sort of compost heroes of the organic gardening or current gardening deal is Charles Dowding, who he has a 4 separate. He has a pallet system with 4 separate sections that each section is a different variation of what compost that is composted, essentially, of being broken down.
Uh-huh.
You could, and yeah, that's a much more common method, is to have pallets lined up and you transfer from one pile into the next over time. For our listeners, if they're interested in that, Charles Dowding, he's a cool guy. Also, before we close this off, compost recently, I've stumbled upon people using compost as basically like heat for indoor spaces, or generally unheated greenhouses. So someone like I saw this on Sean Dombrowski's channel. For our listeners, it's Edible Acres on YouTube. Sean Dombrowski is in Ithaca, New York. He's a very, very nice guy, very cool dude. And he experimented with having a hot compost system in one of his low tunnels, which is an unheated greenhouse. And he did that after the year before, realizing, wow, I'm measuring the temperature of this thing and it's roaring. It's like 160 degrees constantly throughout the winter. How can we take advantage of this heat? And he's not the first person to do it. Other people have taken hot composts and put them into some sort of high tunnel or low tunnel system and used that as the free heat source throughout the winter to keep their plants happy. The ones that are cold hardy crops that otherwise would still do fine and survive in the unheated greenhouse, but they just like it a little bit better with the warmer temperatures, which I thought was really cool and really unusual. It's also, I mean, you have to think about how the larger the pile is, the more heat it's going to be creating, the larger the mass, the more heat. And so I've seen examples of people heating their homes, or at least part of their home, with a compost pile, which is ridiculous. But imagine basically a bunch of straw bales in a circle about as tall and as large in terms of diameter as like a swimming pool, just filled with leaves, filled with whatever compost materials. I think mostly what I've seen is stuff just like leaf mold or whatever. And then at the bottom of it is some sort of tube that the hot air from the pile can travel through the tube and into the home, but there's also some sort of ventilation. So there's no smell issue. It's just the heat. And maybe it travels underground. I'm not too well practiced, or I don't understand this process very well, but I've just seen it and it's amazed me.
That sounds
And
like
yeah, that
the Jean Pain method, but I haven't heard it used with air in the tube and to heat a home. I've seen it for heating water, for making like hot outdoor showers or even indoor showers. The water picks up the heat from the pile and can, through conduction, I think that's the right term, the hot water rises and will leave the pile and move to wherever you lead the pipe to, whether that's a shower head or a hot water heater.
that's wild. I've never heard of that. You said it, the what method?
Oh, Jean Pain. It's like a French. I don't know if he's a permaculturalist. I don't know if he described himself that way, but it's called the Jean Pain method. If people are Jeanpain.
Well, you learn something new every day. So I'd say that's probably a good conclusion to our fall abundance, fall leaves, taking advantage of all the abundance of fall and compost episode. Do you have any last final remarks?
No, I think we covered composting pretty well in this episode. And once the season winds down, it's nice to start focusing on things other than your plants, and more about infrastructure and fertility and getting ready for the following year. So I think it's very timely.
Cool. All right. Well, if you made it this far, friends, we tried to make this episode a little bit shorter than our normal hour and a half spiel.
And we have an Instagram now, Forest Garden Podcast on Instagram.
Yeah, so we have an Instagram. It's called Forest Garden Podcast, and you can find us and DM us. If you also want to get in contact with us via email, our email is theforestgardenpodcast@gmail.com. Additionally, if any of our listeners are interested in submitting a question to the podcast, maybe if you were a little confused about any of the things that we talked about or some of the terms that we used, if you have any sort of feedback, we'd love to hear it. Send it in to us. It's great if you can record it as a MP3 file in your own voice. If you do this, we can include you in one of the episodes. We won't give away your full name. Usually just we provide a first name and where you're from and your question or your comment, and we'll respond to it on air. So I don't know. I think that's really cool, and we'd love to hear from you. You can send it in once again to theforestgardenpodcast@gmail.com, or send us a message on Anchor, which is the hosting platform that we use, or you could send it via Instagram.
That's right. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, everybody. See you next time. Bye bye.